And welcome back. It's been a while since I recorded a video here in the studio, and it's nice to be back because it's easier for me, to be completely honest. And today we're talking about the brand new Sony 50-150 F2. Now, as you can tell, I don't have it here, but I was able to try it, and I was able to compare it to the Tamron 35-150, which is my one of my go-to lenses since I've invested in Sony, and it's actually one of my unsung hero for my Sony journey. So I was able to compare them, and I was able to test the 50-150 in a couple of scenarios, mainly portraits and something outside where I could test a couple of things. Now, of course, a few hours of using the lens is never going to be enough for me to call this a review, so these are just first impressions, but our first impressions not coming of reading about the lens or watching someone else's video about the lens. I've been actually using the lens, and I'm grateful that I was given the chance to do it, because it's not every day that you can test a lens that costs $3,900 if I'm not wrong, excluded tariffs. We don't know where we are with that just yet. And let's just start with the construction of the lens. The lens is constructed pretty well. Of course, it's a G Master lens, and it's one of those with the metal plate, so it's one of those that is a G Master if you want. It's white, which I don't like, and there's a reason for that that we'll discuss in a second. And of course, it's built like a tank. It's built really well. It's got all the options that you can have on a lens like this, and it's really nice to handle. It's very compact when it comes to the length of the lens. This is the Tamron 35-150, and they weigh pretty much the same weight. However, the 50-150 is much better balanced. So even if it basically weighs the same weight of the Tamron, the Sony is so balanced that once you put it on your camera and you start using your camera, of course your camera has to have a decent grip, of course, you don't feel the weight of the lens, which for a lens like this, it's kind of a big deal because it's a 1.3 kilo lens, if I'm not wrong, and so you would consider it's a heavy lens. But the fact that it's very well balanced is it doesn't extend, so it zooms internally. It's really nice. I didn't really feel the weight of the lens at all, which is not the case with the Tamron. The Tamron is much more front heavy. It extends as you zoom, and so it's not as comfortable to use as it is the 50-150. And the 50-150 is f2 constant throughout the aperture range. The one thing is, like, the front lens is pretty big, and so when it comes to putting filters on that, it's not as easy as it is on the 35-150, because this is 82. And while it could not be a big deal, it kind of is, because when you're shooting a 50-150, it's typically a portrait lens, a portrait-oriented lens. You may want to use it wide open when you're shooting in the sun, and that means you may be needing some ND filters. Going that size, it's a little bit more expensive, and you may not have it as a portrait shooter. You usually don't deal with lenses that big, that big of a front element. So things you need to factor in. However, for the price you pay for the lens, the filter is going to be the least of your issues. But when it comes to performance, how does this lens perform? For the type of shot that I was capable of shooting, of taking, the lens performs flawlessly. Now, of course, on a lens like this, you need to use it a lot longer to test the flare resistance. You need to do a lot of stuff to claim the lens to be perfect. But it is as perfect as it gets in my experience with a zoom lens. And it's f2. When it's wide open at f2, it's tack sharp, especially at the telephoto end. It's not that it's not sharp at 50, it is that at 150 is tack sharp. However, 50-150 is not a common focal range. And also, and here comes my complaint with the lens, my only complaint with the lens is it's not compatible with teleconverters. That is the one thing that, to me, Sony did not get right. Because a lens like that, you have a 150 to 150 a 50-150 f2, you can think about using a 1.4 whenever you need a 70 to 200, a 1.4 teleconverter, or you can think of using a 2 times teleconverter when you need a 100 to 300, depending on what it is that you're doing. I was able to shoot this lens also in that kind of a sportish scenario. There was some kite surfing that was happening, and I was able to capture a couple of photos. It's a very good lens for sports as well, and it's great for like indoor sports, being f2. It gets you the separation that you didn't get with an f2.8, and it gets you lower ISO range, also sensibility. So it's perfect for that. But in that scenario, you may end up being a little bit too short at 150. That's where being able to use a 1.4 or a 2 times teleconverter could change dramatically the usability of the lens. And considering that it's not a lens that you're using with teleconverter, so it's not designed with that type of usage in mind, I think that being white doesn't make too much sense. I think that lens should have been typical black, just because it is a lens for basically portrait users, for wedding shooters, for that type of scenario. However, when it comes to image quality, sharpness, I mentioned, is great. The bokeh is so nice. It's buttery smooth. It's hard to find a bokeh that is as smooth as it is on the 50-150. When you shoot at the minimum focus and distance, you can definitely get very good shot, even wide open. It is perfect for portraits. The separation that you get from with the background is very nice. And even at 50 millimeters f2, you get a pretty nice separation that seems to be better than your typical 50 millimeter f2 rendering. That is because the lens is made of pretty quality glass rather than the usual 50 f2 is a cheap lens with lower quality glass. So that's also what plays into the result that I got. I couldn't find a hint of chromatic aberration. Again, this is not a full-on test, so I think if you look for it, sometimes you may end up finding it. I couldn't find any. And I've been shooting in pretty difficult scenarios, so very well done, Sony, on that. It's needless to say, the autofocus is spectacularly fast and accurate. I couldn't miss a shot, really. No, I actually missed a couple, but I think I messed up in there. And it picks up pretty quickly. So from a first impression perspective, this lens is kind of spectacular. Is really a spectacular lens. It's not unique just because of the presence of the Tamron 35-150 and the Samyang equivalent. Although this lens goes from f2 to f2.8, and it's f2 only at the wide, like 30, between 35 and 40, around there, and then it quickly goes to f2.8. But this lens costs basically less than half, sometimes a third of the price of the Sony. Of course, when it comes to this type of things, we are talking about diminishing returns, meaning that you spend twice as much, you don't get twice as much. That is obvious. We all know that. And so if you like the idea of the 50-150, but you cannot afford it, in my experience, this lens has delivered big time, the Tamron 35-150, in the same environment, the same shooting scenario. Of course, aside from the fact that this was a stop slower at the telephoto end, compared to the 50-150, sharpness was kind of similar. Colors were a little bit different. You may like one better than the other. Probably you're gonna like the Sony better than the Tamron, but it's a very good lens. The one thing, there's two big differences. If you're on the fence between the Tamron and the 50-150 because you would like the 50-150, but you don't think about, you don't like the idea of spending that much, there's two scenarios where the 50-150 seem to be a lot better than the Tamron. The first is autofocus. Not in portrait scenario, it's not that big of a difference. The Tamron does pretty well. But if you go into sports and stuff like that, I've been using the Tamron a lot for sport as well, you will definitely feel the difference. The Tamron is average at best when it comes to autofocus. The 50-150 is top notch. And the Tamron has a tendency to suffer a lot from flare, from light coming from right outside of the lens. So those are the two things. If you end up shooting in those scenarios a lot, it's worth thinking about the Sony, because that Sony is gonna realistically get you a lot better for sure in autofocus. I'm pretty sure also when it comes to flare resistance. However, on the other hand, if you cannot afford the Sony, the Tamron is a great option. And that's the catch on the Sony. The Sony is a spectacular lens. However, the Tamron gets you the flexibility of going to 35. If you get the f2 out of the picture, okay, and even if you consider this an f2.8 lens, even though it gets f2 at 35, those 15 millimeters of the wide end, on the wide end, make a lot of a difference. With the Tamron, you can go from a moderate wide angle to 150, and you're not going to be able to put a teleconverter in either of those, okay? Of course, with the Sony, you get faster faster burst rate, because Sony limits what you can do with third-party lenses. But I don't think going 30 frames per second is the bread and butter of a lens like this. But that depends on your usage. But the 35 allows you to use two lenses to do it all. If you're shooting a 16 to 35, in my case, I paired this with the 16 to 25, two cameras, two lenses, you're done. If you're doing weddings, if you're doing events, if you're doing everything that you want, with two lenses, you're done. If you go for the 50-150, you of course get a better lens. You of course get a faster autofocus. You of course get a faster lens at the telephoto end, and you get a better bokeh, although the Tamron is spectacular as well. But I'm going to review the Tamron sooner. I hope soon. But on the other hand, you need to fill the gap between a wide angle, especially in my case, if I'm using the 16 to 25, the gap between 25 and 50 is quite dramatic. If you're using the 16 to 35, you may get away with that depending on your type of shooting. And of course, it's up to you. You may end up needing three lenses instead of two if you're going for the 50-150, depending on your type of shooting. On the other hand, if you're rocking already a high-end Sony body and you're rocking the 28-70 f2 and you pair it with the 50-150 f2, you just bring two lenses, maybe a third if you like a wide angle, and the presence of two f2 zoom lenses begs the question, are we going to have a 16 to 25 f2 or something like that in the future? Who knows? We may end up having that. We'll see. But you're going to rock like three lenses like that, pretty high quality lenses, spending a lot of money, of course. With this, you can probably get away with just two lenses, and if you're on a budget, you can still get pretty amazing results. In conclusion, for my testing, the 50-150 is just as spectacular as a zoom as it gets. It's really hard to find anything that is better than that. I would love to try it for a longer period of time. I would like to try it for a more dedicated type of shooting. I will ask Sony to send one. I don't know if I'm ever going to get an answer from them. And I would love to try the 28-70 because that is a very interesting lens that I haven't had a chance to try. Sony is definitely pushing the boundaries of what is possible to do with zoom lenses, and that makes it exciting for the future because it looks like we're up for a good amount of surprises in the future. Definitely a good lens, a great lens, definitely expensive. It's up to you and it's up to your budget. It's up to what you are willing to spend. If you already have a lot of primes in that range and you're fine swapping lenses, I don't know if buying the 50-150 is going to cut it for you. On the other hand, if you were on the verge of switching, or if you were on the verge of going all in on a full pro system and full pro lens setup, it may be worth to invest $4,000 on a 50-150 instead of spending various thousands of dollars on several focal length, 50 millimeters, 85, 135, and maybe something longer. That is up to your way of shooting. But if you look at it from a business perspective, that lens makes a lot of sense for whoever's starting from scratch or whoever has been shooting with primes but hates swapping lenses. But the fact that the zooms could only go to f2.8 was a showstopper for them. In this case, this is going to solve a lot of those issues. On the other hand, if you're on a budget, keep your primes or look at a lens like the Tamron. It's pretty good. Of course, you cannot expect the same performance. It would be crazy. But you should also understand that the performance is not as far as it may sound by looking at the price tag. I hope you liked the video. I'll see you in the next one. Ciao.